Thanks for joining us again for another topic on collections care and conservation. So it's a bit of a mix today. I'm going to start with condition checking, and then we're in the second half of the training going to talk about display and packing materials. So let's have a look at what we've got planned. So with condition checking, just going to go through when and why this might be necessary, what it is, a bit of an intro about handling objects. I'm sure you are all probably have at least a bit of experience with handling objects, but it does come with part of the territory. When condition checking, you do have to handle objects as part of that. How to identify damage on objects and how to record different ways of how to record the condition of different objects. And then we'll have a little break for a cup of tea or whatever you choose. And then we'll move on to talk a bit more about packing and display materials. What we mean by suitable materials, what suitable materials are, and the best way to pack objects for storage and for display. So that's what we've got planned today, and hopefully it will be of use to you all in some way. So condition checking, what do we mean by this, and why is it necessary? So condition checking, pretty much as it says on the tin, you're checking the condition of your objects in whatever form that takes. But why do we need to do this? May seem, some of the reasons may seem pretty obvious to many of you, but they've just noted down the main points, all of which basically are enabling issues to be identified and resolved, so to improve the understanding of the conservation requirements of the items that you hold in your museum, whether in display or storage. So for example, it is a vital part of preventive conservation and collections care, and should form a part of your care for the objects in your collection. It enables you to understand the environmental, storage and handling needs of all your objects, even from within the same collection and material type. Objects can vary enormously in condition for many reasons, and therefore looking at their condition can help you to understand what kind of environment and storage and handling that particular object may need in order to preserve it. Also aids IPM, so pest management. As you're looking at the condition of objects, you're able to notice pest activity, potentially catch pest activity early on and prevent it from spreading to other collections. And this is particularly important or relevant to do with new acquisitions or loan items coming into your collection, which potentially can bring new pest infestations, insect pest infestations, into your collection and infect your existing items. Following on from that, it is very vital when you're considering items for loan, either objects from your collection going out to other museums or objects from other collections coming into your museum. Either way, if you're loaning objects out, you want to make sure that object comes back in the same condition as it went out. So it's important to note what condition it was before it left. And also, if you are receiving a loan item from another museum, you want to record the condition of that loan as it arrives, so that you can prove that the condition hasn't changed as you send it back. So they are an important part of loan documentation both ways. Additionally, not just in relation to IPM, but it can also, condition checking can also influence the acquisition policy process. So if you are thinking of taking on new items, if you condition check the object before you acquire it, it may affect the decision as to whether you acquire it or not. If it's in very poor condition and you don't have the resources or the storage conditions in order to look after that project the object appropriately, then you may not take that object on. But if it's in quite good condition, or you do have the resources to care for it in that condition, then that may encourage you to take the object on. And of course, any changes in condition, so if you undertake a condition check at various intervals in time, you can see the change in condition in an object, and that can indicate issues in your storage or in your display environment. For example, if your condition check of an object reveals that the object has a new mold infestation or a new pest infestation, that might indicate a failure in the environmental controls, such as dehumidifiers not working, leaks, high humidity that are causing that mold, that are new and that you need to deal with. So it's a good indication to help with collections care. And of course, it can help with insurance claims. If you have a good record of the condition of your collection before something happens, like an emergency situation, a leak, a flood, a fire, then it can help with insurance claims for that. And also with requests for funding. For example, if you have an object that's in need of conservation, if you had a good accurate condition check, condition record for an object, then that could go towards the application for funding. And this is just very general. There are lots of reasons why you might want to condition check your collection and objects, and there's no one purpose, one fit all condition check. A condition survey can be adapted considering what you want to get out of it. So you personally think, if you're considering doing a condition check, which I do advise, think about what you want to get out of it, and you can adapt the survey accordingly. There are lots of different templates available online and in different resources, which I will look at later on. But you can adapt these to your own purposes, and for different reasons for the condition check may need different levels of detail, and we will also talk about that a little later on. So, as I said, condition check, in order to be able to condition check your objects, it is more than likely that you will need to handle the object in order to properly assess its condition. And that brings us back to our good handling that we always need to be aware of when we're dealing with collections, but particularly when we're handling them for prolonged periods of time or in detail, which is what we are doing with condition checking. So hopefully for many of you, this will just be a refresher, but always worth refreshing your memory and your skills with handling objects, because sometimes we can take it a bit for granted. We can pick something up and we haven't quite thought about it properly. We've all done it. So obviously handling objects comes down a lot to common sense. We all pick things up, we all handle things on a daily basis. However, there's a slightly different mindset we need to engage when we're dealing with collection objects as opposed to non-collection objects, because I myself am not, I can be quite clumsy in my house. I drop all sorts of things. I don't want to do that with collections. So it's switching on a different mindset and reducing the risks with that are related to handling objects. So just to run through a few of the top tips. The most important rule is only handle or move objects when absolutely necessary. Is it necessary when you're condition checking? I'd say yes, because condition checking is a benefit. You want to know the condition of your objects, therefore it is necessary to handle the object. But only when you're ready to condition check it and you've thought about all these things that we're going to go through. Moving objects, as I said, can be potentially damaging to the objects, but it can also cause hazard to those handling them as well, such as yourselves. So what do we mean by hazards? These can be innate within the object, so part of its construction, a product of its deterioration or of the object's physicality. So for example, an object might be sharp, it might be heavy, it might be releasing some sort of not very nice compound and as part of its deterioration. So particularly plastics can be an issue with this. They can give out acidic compounds when they're deteriorating, which we need to be aware of. So these types of hazards vary in scale and seriousness, and you need to make a judgment over how to safely handle these objects and whether you can handle these objects. So always visually assess an object before handling to see if there are any immediate hazards apparent. Hopefully, if you are on top of your collections, you will be aware of any hazardous collections that you have in your collection. But you know, every object may present some kind of hazard, whether it's just because it's heavy or tricky. So I'm not just really talking about the very hazardous like asbestos or radiation, because them things you should hopefully know about beforehand, and make sure that these are correctly labelled if you do come across them. Anyway, moving on from hazards, because that's a whole big topic on its own. So yeah, visually assess the object before moving, consult any documentation that you have that may help, particularly with more complex objects, and give your time to think about how to handle things. Make sure you know exactly what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. For example, the things to think about are, is the object heavy? Will it require more than one person? Is the object in multiple parts? Does it have moving parts? Does the item separate into more than one part? Are there signs of previous repairs? Are there any fragile elements? Lots of questions that should be going through your head before you pick up an object, because all these questions will influence the way you interact with this object and how you lift it up. And of course, handling different materials and different items will change how you handle these items. For example, a painting will be moved in a different manner to a ceramic bowl. But in general terms, because I'm not going to spend too long about it on this, you should lift from the strongest part of the object and avoid using handles or decorative areas which may be weaker. If you're going to use resources such as trays, supports, straps, that's brilliant, and that will help to support the object. But make sure that these are in contact with the strongest part of the object as well. So if you're placing something on a tray or a support or using straps, make sure they are engaging with a strong part of the object that's not going to fail when you start to lift. And things like make sure you're not wearing any jewellery or lanyards that could potentially knock or scratch the object that you're handling. And if you are moving the object out of the room or a bit further than just lifting and putting down, and make sure that you've planned your route and your journey. Make sure there's no doors that you have to struggle to open when you've got an object in your hand. Check for obstacles, all these kind of common sense things that you just need to remember that you have thought about during the process. So yeah, overthink it. If anything, they're all things we think about on a daily basis, but just make sure you're going through the process when you're handling collection objects. And of course, mention this in most conservation presentations, but gloves are very important when handling collections. Again, gloves can protect the object and the handler. For example, if you do have a particular hazardous substance, such as objects that have been treated with pesticides in the past or do have some innate material that's hazardous. Gloves can protect you. They can also protect the object because we do have oils and salts and dirt that are on our hands that can transfer onto objects and cause things like corrosion and staining. So it's best to wear gloves. However, it's not a one-fit-all kind of situation. There are some collections where it is advised that actually clean hands are better for careful handling, for example, with paper and textiles, so that we don't snag these materials and tear them. So there are some collections that that do prefer no gloves. However, if you are unsure, then I'd say it's best to err on the side of caution and use gloves for handling. And when we say gloves, so we generally mean nitrile polythene gloves, as you can see in this photo. Cotton gloves have gone out of not fashion, but out of favour really, because they generally don't fit very well. They can be quite loose. They can snag because they're a fibre. They can snag and leave fibres on object surfaces, and they can get dirty very quickly, and they're not washed as often as they should be. So cotton gloves we don't tend to use anymore. Plus, the cotton gloves don't really provide protection for you either, because cotton is porous. Anything that oils from our skin will eventually bleed through onto the object, and vice versa. Any hazardous substance will go the other way onto our hands as well. So in general, it's cotton no, nitrile yes, and then there's just a helpful little table here as well, that if you're dealing with any other objects, for example, if you've got objects stored in the freezer, such as negative photographs, then make sure you're protecting against freezer burn. If you're carrying heavy objects, then you might want to switch your nitrile gloves for one of the normal heavy duty lifting gloves with the extra grip, which are fine. And yeah, obviously, if very sharp or edged objects, then you might want to upgrade on that as well. But in general, nitrile gloves are a good one-fit solution. I'll stop waffling on about gloves. So back to condition checking. We know how to handle our objects. We've thought about it. It is worth the risk. So now, what do we need to do in order to condition check an object? Well, the main point of a condition check is to identify any damage that has occurred to the object. So it is important when condition checking objects for the first time to undertake a very detailed examination and write down and record everything that you see in terms of damage and condition. If you're returning to a pre-written condition check that someone has done in the past that you just need to update, then again you need to assess the object very closely. However, you don't need to write down everything. You should check off the condition compared with the original record, and only note new damage that has happened since the record was written. Hopefully there won't be any new damage, but sometimes there is, and that's the whole point of the record, to keep track of it and see when new damage has been noticed. And that's the same for a condition check for a loan item. Upon going out on the loan, a full condition check is compiled. When it gets to the loan destination, it is checked and any new damage is noted. And then when it returns from the loan institution as well, another check happens and any additional damage noted. So they are working documents ideally. You don't just want to create one condition check for an object and go, yep, that's done, brilliant. You want to, they are a working record. You want to refer to them in the future and add to them when necessary, ideally at a set regular interval, so you are keeping a regular eye on your collections. So we want to note damage. We also want to ideally note what we think is causing the damage, so agents of deterioration, e.g. If there's a hole, is that a result of physical damage or pest damage? You might not necessarily know for sure, but it is good to give your considered opinion. But make sure that you record that it is, you know, to the best of my knowledge, it's probably caused by this. Don't say certainly if you're not certain. So identifying damage, you've got your object. In order to identify the damage, you have to set up your workstation where you can safely assess the object. So ideally this would be a work table covered in padded materials so that the object is safe. Different objects might need a bit of different support on the table. So for example, if it's an object that might roll off the table, you want to make sure that it can't roll off the table. Make sure it's supported by whatever materials you have nearby. For example, Plastazote, or we'll go into materials later, but make sure that the object is safe on your assessing table. Make sure that there's enough light in that area that you can assess, and make sure it's a good environment for you to work as well, because if you are undertaking quite a few condition check assessments, then you want to be happy in your environment if you're going to spend a lot of time there. And make sure you've got additional resources to hand. For example, gloves, we've talked about, a torch. So even if you're assessing the object in a light environment, there might be areas of the object that are a bit darker, a bit harder to see. So a torch is really useful. A magnifier as well, to see small elements of damage. A ruler as well, because if there's a break or a split or a hole, it's useful to measure and things like that, so that you can write down the measurement, and then later on when someone comes to reassess the condition, if that split has lengthened, then they will be able to assess that because you have noted accurately the length of that split originally. A camera as well, because whilst descriptions are great, a photograph is just so much more immediately useful when assessing condition, and an annotated photo is very useful where condition checks are concerned. And the main thing is as well, in part of your workstation, ideally use pencils and not pens, particularly for if you're assessing materials such as paper and textiles. You don't want a pen leaking and ink getting all over your collection, so pencils are just much more controllable. It doesn't mean that you can't take your record away and make it more permanent by writing it up in pen or putting it on the computer. However, next to the object, ideally you should use pencil, just to take that risk away of ink becoming contaminating the object. And this may seem very obvious, but identifying damage, you need to look at the object, look at it in detail and record what you see. It takes practice. It's not hard per se, but you need to record a lot of detail ideally. So take your time and look closely and use the resources that you have to hand. And you don't have to work in pairs, but it's much easier and nicer really to work in pairs. So one person can be looking at the object, another person can be writing down all the information, and you can swap. And if the object is a bit difficult to handle with one person, then you've got a second pair of hands as well, which which is very useful, and it's just nicer to work in pairs. You're not on your own all the time. You can compare what you think about the state of the object and in what condition you think it is as well. So it becomes a bit less subjective if you're discussing it in pairs. So what kinds of damage might we see on an object? I mean, there are loads. And there are lots of different terms for the same things as well. So here we've just got a table of some of the terms of damage that's used by one museum site. If you are wanting to record condition reports on a database, like your collection database, it can sometimes be useful to work with set terms. It just helps with categorizing your object condition. However, this might not work for all museums, but it just helps with consistency. So if you are thinking about a condition checking program or project, then in your initial sort of thought process meeting, have a think about whether we want free-form condition reporting. So the person condition reporting just writes everything they think about the object, or if you want a kind of slightly halfway house where, yes, you want the free form because I think that's important, because it means you can write everything about the condition. However, whether there's a box where you want specific terms of damage to be recorded that are uniform and consistent throughout the whole project. So this is what this would be. So a table of set terms for describing the damage that a person sees on an object. So for example, insect damage, we've got discoloration, yellowed varnish, stains, cuts, rust stains, yellowed sticky tape, indentations. I think most of these are pretty obvious to everyone what they mean. Foxing, if you haven't heard that term before, it's the term for the brown dots appearing on paper that you might see, caused by a myriad of different things, but that's the overarching term of what that phenomena is called. I think accretions is any kind of substance that has appeared on the surface of an object. But I think on the most part they are very self-explanatory terms that people can use. Delamination is where, you know, layers start to come apart. But yeah, it's, if you are considering this, it might be useful to have a table of agreed terms and explanations of what each of these are, or you can just go free form if you're not, if it doesn't have to be put into a specific box in your collection database, for example. But it is useful when you're starting your condition survey to undertake a calibration exercise, particularly if more than one person is going to be undertaking these condition checks. Because as I I alluded to before, with working in pairs, actually we have, I mean, for some objects it's very obvious. If they're in a very bad condition, then most people would put them in a very bad, say it's in a very bad condition, it's falling apart. However, the middle bit between good and bad is very subjective, or we find that it's very subjective. Some people can see an object and say, well, yeah, it doesn't look great, but actually it's quite stable, so I'd say that was fair or good, it's not getting worse. But another person can see the same object and go, oh well, it looks awful, so yeah, it's not very good, it's poor. However, you need to agree in your museum context as to how you are defining them different terms, and that's where a calibration exercise comes in. And I'll keep talking about that over the course of the next couple of slides as well. But as well as identifying damage and describing the condition and damage of the object, it is useful to assign an overarching term of the condition. So, for example, very poor, poor, fair, good, very good, excellent. So if you can agree within your museum of the word's just gone out of my mind, but on the terms that you will use to describe objects of varying condition. It might be a numbering system, 1 to 4, or it might be the descriptive words like poor, good. But it is useful to start any of your condition checks or condition descriptions with a one-word term to overall express the condition. So of course I mentioned, yes, we want to identify damage, but it is good to come back to and hazard a guess at what you think is causing the damage, because this can have very useful knock-on effects of what other collection care priorities you need to be focusing on. For example, if you have an object that has that you think has faded, so the colours have changed and they're faded, then you might have to worry about light exposure in your museum. So it is useful to think about the causes of damage so that you can start to think about how you can prevent further damage from happening. So when I say the causes of damage, I of course mean the agents of decay or deterioration, and these displayed very prettily in a sort of word cloud include light, temperature and relative humidity, dust, pests, fire, water, vandalism, theft, pollutants, dissociation. So all of them agents of decay, as we generally call them. They are the agents of decay, so they are the cause of most damage in a museum context. So for example, most of you are hopefully familiar with some or all of the agents of decay. But so for example, like I say, if you had an object that's faded, it might be due to light damage. So light damage can cause fading, it can cause embrittlement, it can cause structural damage such as tears and loss on some types of materials. Temperature and relative humidity, you might see warping, cracking, splitting, corrosion, mold, lots of other possibilities as well. Dust and dirt, you might see ingrained dirt and accretions, discoloration, corrosion. Physical forces may cause breakages, tears and splitting. Water can cause staining, discoloration, structural weakening, etc. Fire is pretty obvious, burning, staining, discoloration, loss. Pests can cause holes, structural weakening, complete loss, and pollutants, tarnishing, corrosion, discoloration. And vandalism as well can cause graffiti, loss, structural damage. So if you have any of them, so the terms we saw before, if you have any of them, try to match them with one of these agents of deterioration, so that you can keep an eye on the damage and see whether you need to step in and control one of these agents further. For example, if you're having a lot of trouble with light, then blinds. If you're having trouble with relative humidity, then try and see if you can get some control in the form of dehumidifiers, heating, things like that. But I'm not going to go too much into that because it kind of strays a bit out of the topic we're dealing with today. However, these are the things that you need to think about when you are undertaking a condition check. So we've thought about identifying damage, the different types of damage, and also what's causing them. What's the best way to record this in a condition check or a condition record. So as I said before, ideally take multiple photos, because photos are very useful, a useful record, and you can see very clearly the damage, particularly if they're annotated. So they're very useful. If photographs aren't possible, then sketches and diagrams can show damaged areas. I know the National Trust sets a lot of store in their conservation assistance, collections assistants, drawing areas of damage and objects as part of their condition records, because it makes you look closely at the object. So you may be thinking, oh, I can't draw, and believe me, I can't draw either. But I did it, and it does. If you are drawing an object, you do look more closely at it, and it doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be grade A standard art, A level or whatever. But sometimes, yeah, making a sketch or a diagram or a drawing of an object does make you look closer, and it can be useful, even if you do have photographs available. So yeah, annotated sketches, diagrams, photographs, and also record the following information, which includes the relevant details of the object, for example, the object accession number. The date of the condition check is very useful because, as I said, it's useful to come back and update condition checks. So the original date is very useful to see how quickly damage is happening. The name of the condition assessor, because that is useful if you need to go back and check with the assessor about things, or just as a record to see who undertook the condition check. The object name and description of the object. So for example, yeah, what it is, what date it's from, anything you know about the object that's useful, just summarize there. Obviously, hopefully you will have a record of the object on your collection database or your inventory, so it doesn't need to be in detail, but just sort of summary, so that you can recognize the object from the condition report, just in case. Hopefully you will have an object accession number, but sometimes things can be mixed up, so it's useful to have a description as well, and the object name, and then a quick summary of the material or the material composition of the object, because that does have a big impact on the damage it can undergo and the agents of deterioration that it is susceptible to. So for example, wood, it is susceptible to light damage, to damage from RH. It is susceptible to some pests. However, metals isn't susceptible to pests generally, unless it has a light sensitive coating, isn't susceptible to light, is susceptible to RH and dust due to corrosion. So the different materials, well, if an object is made out of specific material, then it undergoes specific deterioration mechanisms. So it is important to note that down. And yeah, then we get on to the recording the condition of the object. So the full condition of the object, if it's a first assessment, or an update for the condition check. So just any new damage if it's just an updated condition check. And as part of the full condition, you want to put in any areas of damage or weakness, and any additional notes that may seem necessary. For example, if you are worried about light damage and fading, maybe make a note about how the object is lit on display, something like that. And as I said, as part of the full condition of the object, it is useful to have an overarching general term as the first word of the description. So like I said, could be very poor, poor, good, very good, or it could be numerical. So 1 is good, 4 is very bad. So that's a decision that you can make as part of your museum as to how you would like to record that. But it is useful to have that term, so that you don't have to read the full description if you just want an overview of what the condition of that object is. Particularly if you're using these condition checks as a tool to identify needs of conservation. So if you're wanting to make a priority list of what objects in your collection need conservation treatment, then these terms can be very easily used to prioritize that list. So for example, obviously there are other considerations as to, you know, the significance of the item. However, objects that are in very poor or poor condition might go further up the priority list for conservation treatment than those that are in good or very good condition. So it is useful to have a general term to describe the overall condition. And when you're thinking of these terms, for example, yeah, poor, fair, good, very good, or 1 to 4, 1 to 5, it's useful. It helps not to have a middle category. Don't know, try and just explain what I mean by that. So if you do go with categories such as poor, fair, good, excellent, a lot of people are very tempted to put the object in fair, because fair, it doesn't mean good, but it doesn't mean poor. So it's kind of like, yeah, it's all right. And a lot of objects end up in that category. However, if you take the fair category away and you have very poor, poor, good, very good, or excellent, something like that, you don't have that middle category. You've got to make a decision between, is that object in a good condition or is it in a poor condition? And that can be, that I feel as a conservator is a useful decision to make. No one wants to make that decision. No one wants to put their object in a poor category. However, for conservation and for collections care, I think making that decision and dividing that so that you're not just, oh, it's fair. You have made that decision to say that it's good, we don't necessarily have to worry about it, to it's poor, actually we might need to worry about this. So, you know, completely up to you as you're setting these categories. However, in my experience, a lot of stuff gets lumped in fair if you do have that middle category, and it's not as useful as making a decision as to whether something is poor or good condition. So hopefully you get that, but we'll stop for questions in a second, so you can ask me what on earth I meant by that. So just to show you a few templates that are available for recording condition. This one's off the Collections Trust website. And again, it's just, as I said on the previous slide, it has places to record the accession number, the object name. It has a space for a photo, a space for the description, condition, any hazards, and any additional information. So it is pretty much the categories that I said before. So these are the templates. You can adapt these templates to make sure they're suited for what you want to get out of a collection check. This might be fine. You might want different categories to marry up with your collection database. So you need to think about how you want to store this information. Do you want physical records, so keep it in a file and it's written, or do you want to be able to put this digitally on your collection database or save them as separate digital files? So how do you want to be able to save and access information? Because this will affect the categories that you want on your condition form. For example, if you do want to marry it up with your collection database, you will have to, you know, either go with the the provisions on your collection database about what the different sections are, or you can work with your collection database provision to, I know some projects have involved museums liaising with their collection database provider to make sure that the boxes that they want for condition checking are integrated into the system. However, that might not be possible for all places, but the main takeaway is make sure that your template, your condition check template, is suitable for you. And I might put in a separate box for the overall condition category that I've been waffling on about for a few slides now. So I might create a separate box just above condition saying overall condition assessment and put that that judgment in there. So very poor, poor, good, very good, or 1 to 4, 1 to 5. So this is another template, again on the Collections Trust. It's pretty much the same information in a different layout. So again, accession number, object name. This one has date and examined by, which is very useful, I find. Object location as well. Materials present, dimension. So this one's a bit more in detail. It has a bit more background information for your object, but again, has images, condition assessment. So again, these templates exist, but you can adapt them to whatever you need. And again, I believe there's one, if you have the housekeeping, a National Trust Manual of Housekeeping, I believe there is another template in there. And this is just a slightly different one. So we've been working on the assumption that we are creating a condition record for each individual object at your museum, which is, the paradigm. Ideally, yes, it's good practice to have up-to-date condition records for each of your objects in the collection. However, in practice, a lot of museums don't, because it involves time, it involves resources, and they're things that we fall short of occasionally. So there's this different style of condition report that I've used a few times. And this is kind of a condensed version, more used for a condition audit rather than a condition check as part of an object record. So I use this personally when doing a sample condition audit for a collection. So by that I mean doing a basic condition check for a sample of objects throughout the museum. So it might be a 5% sample, it might be a 10% sample, it might be lower than that if it's a massive museum. And in that, we're just trying to get a useful snapshot of the condition of the collection, and the care of and the care of collections that goes alongside that. So we are getting a snapshot of the condition, which might show us something about the conditions in that museum and give us a bit more information about what the issues might be. So, for example, if we find a lot of objects with biological damage, then such as pests and mold, that might be something to do with the relative humidity is not as it should be in that museum for that collection. However, so I've been using this as a sort of condition audit, so a snapshot of a percentage of the collection. However, you can do your entire collection using a form like this. It's a very basic version. It doesn't involve a full description of the condition and a full record. It is just a snapshot, as I say. So we've got the different categories here. So again, we've got the object. So that's object name and object number. And again, you can add to this or take away from this to suit your needs. So information about the object name, object number, image. So we've not been putting the image in the spreadsheet, but we've been putting an image name that relates to a file that you can access remotely. Location of the object, the last condition check. So again, it can be used as a working document, as in for multiple condition checks over the years. And condition, so column E would be where we put the condition, overall condition assessment. So you can see the key here that I've pasted in the middle of the table. So condition, so here we've got 1, 2, 3, 4. So 1 is good condition, 2 is fair condition, requires surface cleaning only, 3 is poor condition, requires minor conservation work, and 4 is an acceptable condition, requires substantial conservation work. So here I have done the pet peeve that I've just told you not to do. I've put fair as an option. However, we have defined what we mean by fair. So hopefully that does make us make a decision on to whether it's fair or poor or good. So it's good to define what you mean by your overall assessment. So that code would go in there. Any notes on handling, because as I said at the start, handling is an important part of dealing with collections. And then we've just got this very small snapshot of damage and the condition of the object. So again, if we go back down to the key, we've got major structural damage, we've got minor structural damage, surface damage, chemical decay, insect damage, or biological damage, such as insect damage, mold, foxing, accretions, such as anything that's on the surface of the object, dirt, grease, soil, and historic repair. So it is just a tick box. So if something's majorly structural damage, tick. Minor structural damage, tick. Surface damage, tick. Or leave it blank if it doesn't undergo that. So it is very basic. It's not as detailed as the ones we've seen before. However, it has its purpose and it has its use, and it might be the one that suits you. And again, you can alter it so that it does suit you. There's lots of different permutations, and one condition audit or condition template that suits another museum may not necessarily suit your museum. So think about how you can adapt these resources for your own use. But this is, as I said, it's not very detailed, this one. It is just a snapshot, but it is useful for when you've got limited time and you'd rather know a basic condition overview than nothing at all. So it's useful for when you have limited time, for example, for project work. For example, if you're moving the collection at short notice, and you just, before you move it, you want to know what the basics of what the issues are, or if you've had an emergency situation and you need to undergo a condition check before or after that, just to again get a snapshot. Or if you're just conducting an audit of your collections to see what the main issues are. For example, the example I gave before about, if you undertake a snapshot condition audit for a percentage of your collection and a lot of them are suffering from mold, then you need to deal with the environment in your museum. So it has its place and it is useful. And it is pretty much the same information, it's just in a condensed layout. Let's continue with packing and display materials. Another very exciting topic, if you like me. So it's a big topic for museums because we all need to store and pack collections at one point or another. And how we pack and display museum objects has a huge impact on protecting them from all of the external factors that put them at risk. So again, the risks that I outlined before are the agents of decay. So we are at all times trying to protect objects from that, and storage and packing and display can present quite a few of them risks that we need to protect against. So if done correctly, storage and display can provide protection, preserve objects, and display, of course, obviously presents objects to the public as well, which is, as museums, and heritage locations is one of our primary objectives. However, if done poorly, it can contribute to damaging the objects, which is not what we want. Again, as I said, with condition checking, a lot of, or not condition checking, but handling, object packing and storing can seem to be a lot of common sense and things that can be quite obvious and fairly straightforward to many people when we're talking about protecting collections. However, there's a slight different way of looking at it too. For example, how you would maybe pack up your house to move house. Obviously, you want to protect your objects as well. However, we're not always thinking of long-term or not as long-term as we think in the museum sector. So there are slightly different things we need to think about concerned when we're talking about museum objects. And again, different institutions have different methods, they have different resources and funding, but there are some useful guiding principles that if we know, then it is of use to us, and there are common methods and materials that it is useful to know. So here we've got two photos, one on the left of a box that isn't packed very well. There's not a lot of protective packing in there. The objects are touching. There's lots of different materials in there that could react with each other. And if you start moving that box, then things will start to bash against one another. Conversely, on the other side of the slide, we have a much better packed box. You can see the two objects packed in that box. They're very well packed. They're not going anywhere. So they're protected from physical damage if that box is moved, but you can see them as well, because that is part of the issue with packing, is that we are kind of hiding the object from view, so that can increase risk as well. So in that box you can still see the objects, but they can't move and cause damage to each other, and they are both of the same material type, so unlikely to cause issues to each other as well. So let's get stuck in. So just to sort of open talking about objects on shelves or on display. So a lot of the time you may find it in your museums as well. Objects are normally, a lot of objects are just stored on open shelves in a sort of open type of storage. Not all objects are stored boxed. A lot of museums do not have the resources to store all their collections boxed, which is not an issue. Collections can be cared for and protected on open shelving as well. However, where this is the case, there are several things to remember, and the main points are listed here. So general rules are place a barrier layer under the objects, so between the shelf and the object, to provide a bit of physical buffer to stop the object and shelf in contact, and particularly if the shelf is of a hard material like metal and you have a ceramic, prevents physical damage and chipping and things like that. So often we advise the use of an inert foam, and I'll come on to the different kinds of materials a bit later, but it just provides a little bit of padding. Doesn't need to be too thick, just a little bit of padding, and it also stops objects from potentially sliding, again if it's metal shelving and it's quite smooth, and it protects from vibrations. So if you do have a bit of movement in the shelves as people are walking around the store, then some objects can start to move on the shelf, and their vibrations between the shelf and the object can start to damage it. However, if you have this buffer layer in place, then it can absorb them slight vibrations and just generally keep them more secure on the shelf. Another important point, do not overcrowd shelves or have objects touching one another. I know this is a huge issue because space is a huge issue in museums. Um, I can probably hear some of you going, yeah, we probably have overcrowded shelves, not much we can do about that. It's the same in most museums. I think it's very difficult. Space is at a premium. However, if you do have the capacity to not overcrowd shelves or to store things in a way that they are not too crowded on the same shelf and not touching one, at least not touching one another, then that is the ideal. Because again, if they are objects of different materials touching one another, they can affect each other, but also with the vibrations I mentioned earlier, if there is a bit of movement, then they start banging against each other, and it's just harder to see and access objects if they're overcrowded. And this carries on to the next one. So to the best of your ability, make all objects visible without the need to move objects. So obviously, if your store isn't overcrowded, then you will hopefully be able to see all of your objects and move them without moving other objects. You know, very hard to be able to not need to move multiple objects to move one object at the back of your shelf. However, I suppose the ideal is make sure that, you know, the minimum amount of objects need to move in order to get your object to the back of the shelf. Because, you know, moving objects when you don't need to move them, so you're not trying to get that object, it's just an increase in risk. So make sure that you can access objects with the minimum amount of moves of other objects. That makes sense. Don't hide smaller objects behind larger. It just increases the risk. If you can't see an object, you don't know it's there, you're not considering what your actions are doing to hurt that object. So you're focusing on this big object, you're getting that down, you might knock the smaller object that you don't know is even there. So make sure, again, very, very closely connected to the above point, make sure all objects are visible. Aim to have everything accessible. Yeah, again, make sure you can reach objects. If you are storing objects higher up, make sure you have the capacity, like ladders or forklifts, to be able to access them. And if you can store heavier objects lower to the ground, then that is easier. They are easier to access, and it is less of a risk for you guys accessing them as well, rather than standing on top of a ladder trying to get a heavy object down, or two people on ladders trying to get a heavy object down. You're on the floor and you can get as many people as you need to lift them heavy objects. So just think about how things are arranged in the store. Don't drag or slide objects out to you when you're retrieving them. You know, you want to be able to lift the object clean off the shelf so that you're not causing any abrasive or physical damage as you're moving it off the shelf. And particularly if you don't have that buffer layer as well, if you don't have the buffer layer and you're dragging an object off a hard metal shelf, then that will obviously cause some damage to the surface of the object, particularly if it's a very fragile surface object. Things can become detached and wear and tear can build up. And when on display, ensure that mounting materials and stands are of conservation grade, and inert materials and the supports fully support the object. So we'll dig into that a bit more further on, particularly in regards to what we mean by inert materials and conservation grade. But again, it's very case by case basis because objects are very different. It's much easier to support like a run-of-the-mill object like a box, which has a flat base that just, you know, you sit on a shelf, it's well supported, job done. However, if you've got a more intricate object that doesn't necessarily sit on a surface properly, like a round object, or something that's meant to be carried, a hat or something like that. Not you carry a hat, you put it on your head, but something that requires a different support other than a flat surface, and you might need to think a bit more in depth about what support that might need. whether it's a custom-made mount that supports it at the strongest point of the object, or some sort of build-up on the shelf of buffer, soft foamy material that can meld to the shape of the object and support it more than a flat surface. So it's very case by case, object specific, but if you can think in terms of is the object fully supported, and are we using the correct materials, and work from there. So what we mean by the correct materials, we've got a few listed down here. This list is not exhaustive. There are many other things that are suitable, but these are the kind of the main things that if you work in and around museums, you've probably heard of, or you encounter again and again, or hopefully anyway. So we've got, you know, I probably won't read them all out, but we've got the acid-free tissue paper and card. Basically, what all of these things have in common is the fact that they're chemically inert and will not introduce anything that will increase the rate of deterioration for the object to be stable. So these materials are stable, they have predictable properties that will allow us to know how they will react with our collection objects and how they age. And they are also useful objects, useful materials that provide support, they provide a function. And some of them have been developed specifically for the conservation world, for example, Tyvek, cotton tape, and Plastizote, but lots that have we've adapted from other industries as well. But one of the main suppliers of conservation materials, you've probably all heard of it, is PEL, and Conservation by Design. There are a lot of other companies as well, but they have lots of lists of different types of materials, and they will specify their specifications as to whether they're inert, suitable for long-term storage and display and things like that. And again, I'll come back to what we mean by inert in a bit more detail in a few minutes. But just in case you're not completely familiar with all of this, I think polythene sheeting, polythene bags are pretty self-explanatory. It's a type of plastic that is more stable than other types of plastic, less likely to decay and emit deteriorating chemicals. We've got some metal, stainless steel pins, brass paper clips. These metals, although they can corrode, and also powder coated metal shelving as well, they are a type of metal and coated to prevent conservation for long-term use and storage, which is why they are deemed as suitable materials, because the risk of corrosion is low and over a long period of time. So they should be suitable for storage and display and do not emit any horrible chemicals when they decay. So we've got Tyvek here, which is a trade name, in case you haven't come across it before. It's a lightweight, breathable, inert fabric which can be stitched or glued together. It's resistant to tearing, it protects from dust particles, and it's also, there is a type that's water resistant as well. So it's ideal for protecting paintings, rolled textiles, furniture, any kind of collection object, protecting from dust, light, water, or light showers of water. And it's also used for labels as well, because they're water resistant and durable and can be tied to objects. Plastizote, again a trade name. It's a conservation grade inert foam that's used a lot in museums, so you have probably come across it. It's stable, it's safe, it's non-reactive polyethylene foam. So a lot of these are types of plastics, but they are plastics that have been tested and are known to be long-term stable. And they come in a variety of, so for example, plastic comes in a variety of different thicknesses. It can be easily cut with a Stanley knife into different sizes, shapes. and it's a good shock absorber, so often used as the barrier level layer on shelving that I mentioned in the earlier slide, but also for protecting objects during travelling as well. Cotton tape, which is pictured there, is just an unbleached cotton tape that's useful for tying labels on or for securing objects. For example, if you're moving an object with moving parts or opening doors and you want to secure them before moving. Correx is a corrugated plastic sheet board, and it's basically a shock absorber, so used a lot in building work to protect surfaces. And again, that's what we use it for in conservation as well. So again, it can be used to line shelves because it has that shock absorber. So just quite a useful material in different contexts. Melanex, again, a brand name of polyester film used for protecting and supporting particularly 2D objects such as paper, photographs, so that you don't actually have to handle the paper or photograph itself. And I think most of the others, really useful boxes, again, boxes made out of long-term stable plastic. 2B pencils, I mentioned before. Ideally, we want to use pencils in a museum context just in case pen leaks. But 2B pencils are particularly soft and can be rubbed out quite easily if you are using them to mark collection items such as paper. So we've got all these suitable conservation materials and many more besides. And also in your museum, you're likely to have storage furniture that you use as storage for protecting your collections as well, which is fine. However, it is worth noting that yes, there are some materials that do emit harmful chemicals, which I'll move on to now. So just before I do, you saw the term acid-free quite a lot in the previous slide. What does it mean and why is it important? It is mostly applied when discussing paper, but it can also refer to things such as card and storage boxes. Basically, it means it's made differently to what we call normal modern paper in its process and source material. So standard paper nowadays is usually made from wood pulp, which is usually acidic because it includes a substance called lignin, which is part of wood pulp, which degrades to emit acidic compounds and turns the paper brown and brittle. And that's not what we want for collection storage. So this paper and cardboard, things that we use in collection storage, has to be acid-free because it is made from things like acid-free wood pulp, cellulose paper, or it's made from cotton fibres, rag paper, which is what older papers used to be made out of, which is why they're better quality and last longer, or Japanese papers made from naturally acid-free fibres from the bark of specific trees. So that's what we mean by acid-free. It's just a different type of paper that doesn't include the acids that make modern papers, such as particularly newspapers, go brown and quite brittle quite quickly. So that's what we mean by acid-free. So unsuitable materials, I won't spend too long on this, but basically non-acid-free things like cardboard, paper, tissue. Newspaper, as I said, is an acidic type of paper. We tend to use it a lot. Well, I certainly did when I was moving house to pack up my stuff, but we wouldn't use it in a museum context because it is very acidic and can emit harmful acids, but also the ink of the newspaper print can also transfer onto collections as well. What makes all of these materials unsuitable really is the fact that as they degrade, they do emit harmful vapours such as acidic vapours, formic acid, acetic acid, formaldehyde, or other pollutants that can affect different types of collections. For example, wood and composite boards, they do emit acidic vapours as they degrade. Some woods are better than others, so if you have wood in your storage areas, don't worry too much, particularly if it's quite historic wood, because they do off gas over a period of time. So the older the wood is, the less harmful it is. But lots of people have wooden storage in their collections, so it can be an issue, but just keep an eye on it, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. I keep promising that. Dyed textiles, dyes can run. Woolen textiles often have pesticides sprayed onto them, particularly modern wool textiles, because of their attraction to pests, and those that don't are attracted to pests, so they're not ideal to use in a museum context. Cotton wool can snag on objects and leave fibres. Polyurethane foam is cheap and easily available, but it does degrade quite badly and becomes sticky. Also with PVC polyvinyl chloride materials, they also degrade and become sticky. Biodegradable packing peanuts are made of water-soluble materials, so can start to biodegrade as they're meant to, but not ideal in a museum context, as we're talking about long-term storage. Blue tack is very greasy. If you ever use blue tack on your walls and take it off, if you ever try and paint over it, your grease mark from your blue tack will emerge over time onto your new wall surface. So very hard to get the grease out once you have put blue tack on anything. Again, with pressure sensitive adhesive tapes, the adhesive attaches onto objects. Even when you've taken the tape off and leaves marks, it becomes yellow. Paperclip, staples, pins, again, issues with corrosion unless they're specially treated, or like stainless steel varieties. Elastic bands can degrade very quickly and break up and stick to whatever object they're holding together. And I've mentioned the composite boards. Yeah, they start to degrade and off-gas acidic compounds. So we keep saying unsuitable, suitable, inert, conservation grade. Basically, what kind of differentiates these materials is the testing that has been undergone in previous over the history of conservation. And one of the first tests to be developed was the Oddy test by a guy called Andrew Oddy at the British Museum in the 1970s. And it's basically an accelerated corrosion test for the effects of these off-gassing materials on metals. So it shows how suitable these materials are over time when they're displayed or used in storage with different metals. So this is kind of an overview of what the Oddy test involves: a test tube, the test sample in the test tube, and then it's heated up, and there's a sample, a metal coupon in there, either silver, brass, no, silver, copper, or something else, and it's heated artificially quite high to develop the accelerated aging test. And then, depending on whether the metal coupon has corroded or tarnished, and to what extent during that time, determines whether that material is suitable for long-term storage or not. So it is a test used to test, display and storage conservation materials for their suitability for use, and to check whether harmful chemicals or compounds are released during the test. But don't worry, I mean, there are lots of instructions online as to how you undertake your own testing. However, the British Museum have done a lot of testing on their own, and they have this list of materials and display materials, storage materials, adhesives, conservation resources that they have pre-tested, and you can look for your whatever material you want to use on this database and see whether it has already been tested. And you can see the color coding down the side. Green means it has passed, it is suitable for long-term display and storage. So for example, what have you got here? Well, these are all adhesives, but Paraloid is all passed for long-term safety use. The yellow is suitable for temporary use, so temporary storage. So if you've got a temporary exhibition, temporary storage for a project, then that's okay. And then the red is obviously a fail. You shouldn't use that material in a museum context. So all these resources are out there to see whether you're using the right materials or not for your storage, and particularly for your display. So we know what kind of materials we've got to use. Now we need to pack our objects for storage. So just again, like with anything conservation, it's very object specific. It's important to consider your specific object for packing, what it needs, what support it needs, how big it is, things like that. However, these are the basics which you can adapt to your situation. So basically, pack collections in ways that minimise the need for future handling, such as placing them in supportive nests of acid-free tissue rather than wrapping them up. So the wrapping versus puffs of nesting methods, wrapping isn't necessarily wrong. It's just that you can't see the objects when they're wrapped. So ideally, you want like the top photo there, you can see the nested objects. You can still see them. Obviously, you'd have to get them out to fully look at them. However, you can see them. You can see they're there. However, if they're wrapped up completely, you'd have to unwrap them just to see what's in the box, which increases handling. Also, if they're not nested like that and they're wrapped, and you've got a very small object right at the bottom of your box wrapped in tissue, and you think, oh, I've unwrapped everything in this box, it's all just tissue now, you might risk throwing an object away. It's low risk, hopefully, but it is something I'm always worried about. If you've got a small object wrapped in tissue, you're not quite sure whether it's just a lump of tissue or an object. So ideally, I prefer nests, but you know, in some cases, wrapping an object might be necessary. So clearly label the outside of storage boxes, garment covers, etc., to minimise handling, and place a contents list in the top of the box. So again, it's minimising handling so that you know what's in a box without having to unwrap it, because you don't necessarily want to see the object all the time. You just want to know where it is and check you've got it. So if you've got a list, and then if you want to double check and open the lid, then you can see the object as well. That's a double tick. So the main aim is to support the object with the packing material so that it doesn't move around within the box, drawer, enclosure, shelf, but don't overfill boxes, because this puts pressure on the objects. Make sure you don't put heavy objects on top of fragile objects. Obviously, a lot of common sense coming back to play here as well. So obviously, you know, not overfilling boxes, easier said than done when you've got less resources and things have just accumulated. But it's a good aim to have, to make sure that you're not stuffing boxes full, and the objects are happy within their storage. Where multiple objects are packed within the same box, they should be separated by packing materials to avoid surface-to-surface contact and subsequent damage. So yeah, it's basically preventing physical damage from objects knocking together in the box. And consider the weight as well as the space, because someone has to lift this box. It might be you. You're not going to thank the person who packed it if it's too heavy to lift. And if it is a heavy object, then you need to think about whether the box is strong enough to contain it. If you're going to lift it up, is it going to fall out the bottom? Do you need an extra heavy duty box, or do you need lifting materials to help with that? And there's loads of resources online. Again, I will send some more resources out, but National Museum Scotland in particular has good resources for packing different types of objects. And continued, so when choosing storage containers, take into account the internal space required for both the objects and the packing materials, the strength of the box and the weight of the objects, as well as the storage systems, whether they will fit. So lots to think about there, but it is basically summed up by, will the object and packing fit in the box, and is the box suitable? As we've kind of been hinting at throughout this entire part of this PowerPoint. Implement a programme of regular condition checks, including evidence of insect activity for items in storage. So if you are on a restorage project and you've restored all your collections in a great way, they're all safe, that's brilliant. However, don't just forget about them. They're still at risk, not a big risk, but you still need to do regular checks, just to check for insect activity, make sure things are safe, make sure they're happy in the new storage that you've given them. And collection or storage areas should be clearly designated as such and should not be used for storing non-collection materials. It's very tricky again. It means, you know, space is limited. Collection storage in many museums often ends up being used for storage for other departments, education, any, you know, other things within the museum. Ideally, it wouldn't be. Having a space designated for collections means that it's more easily controlled, it's easier to prevent pest infestations, it's easier to make sure you are using the correct materials in the store and that there's no threat from off-gassing. And make sure that, as far as possible, the optimum environmental conditions for mixed collections are maintained and monitored within the storage areas. So we've got a couple of very quick videos because I know we're reaching the end of the line, but these just want to point out that please don't use orange tissue for your tissue sausages and tissue puffs. I am at home and this was the only piece of tissue I could find in my house, and it just makes it easier for you to see. So if you've never used tissue sausages or tissue puffs before, they're just very useful things to be able to create for storage and packing. So I don't know whether you can hear me, but basically you fold the paper forward and back to make a concertina. Keep going until you're halfway down the piece of paper, or you can use a full piece of paper for the concertina. And then when you get to halfway, wrap the remaining tissue around the concertina, just to make a bit of padding. And you can, if you wanted a bigger sausage, you can use a bigger piece of paper, or you can concertina the whole way round, the whole way down, and wrap it in a separate piece of paper. And you get a padded sausage that you can use. You can mold it into shape. You can use it inside sleeves of garments, and you can tuck the ends in to make it neater if you want. So that's a useful one. And then the other useful one is the tissue puff. So basically you take your square of tissue and you start to fold it in from the outside. So if you keep going all the way around, folding in the outside into the middle, keep going all the way around to create a kind of tissue hat, if you prefer, or a tissue mushroom. Keep going, and you can roll it up all the way into the middle to create quite a dense puff or mushroom, or you can sort of fold it out a bit to create a bit more of a pad, but you can sort of meld it into whatever shape you want, and they're good for nesting objects in. Because sorry, I apologize for the random videos of me doing that. Or normally I quite in person training, I quite like everyone to sort of make a tissue sausage or puff, but obviously that's quite difficult over the internet. So hopefully you can put up with me doing a video of it. And then just lastly, to finish off, because I know we're near the end, it's like I said, you can have these kind of basic forgotten the word again. I apologize, my brain's turning to mush, but you can have these guidelines for packing objects. However, it is down to the individual object, and you have to make that decision when you come to pack an object. A lot of them can be quite straightforward, but some of them are less so. And some might need bespoke packaging. So they might be so they would be more time consuming and require a few more additional resources. But it is in the object's best interest if it would be at risk using usual packing methods such as puffs or what we've kind of been talking about for the past couple of slides. Particularly for objects that have very fragile surfaces. So tissue puffs and sausages, I do love them a lot. However, they will exert some degree of pressure onto the object. And if the surface of the object is not stable enough, then even the tissue puffs can do some damage, physical damage to them. So instead, you've got this this example here on the left. We have two jugs that I sort of pressure wedged in place rather than having tissue near the sides, which I suspect is because the surface is quite vulnerable and friable, so you don't want anything touching the decoration. And also things that might need a bit more extra thought if you've got small numerous objects that might need additional packaging, such as glass and pottery shards. You can't just put one individual thing in a tissue puff. You might have to put them in individual little boxes that then you put in tissue puffs or cut out in Plastazote. And polythene Ziploc bags can also be used to separate smaller objects as well. And again, the other thing that might need bespoke packing are large objects. In storage, large objects don't necessarily need to be packed, stored packed, and they can just sit on shelves. Ideally, they would be lifted off the floor, so often on pallets. I'm not saying you don't have a massive gorilla in your collection, but you never know, you might do. However, they might need to be boxed during transport, and then that is often you need bespoke packaging for something like that. Here you can see he's fixed to a surface, and he's just got this little seat belt around him to stop him moving anywhere around. But most of the time you might want to have a dust protection over him or a large object, but they don't necessarily need to be boxed or crated in store. But it's always worth thinking about what their needs are. So I'm going to stop there because I feel like I'm waffling. There's just a few more pictures of different bespoke storage for large objects, so pallets and Plastazote again there, just fixing things in place.